Dr. James Chen stood in his pristine clinic on the 47th floor of Manhattan Medical Tower, reviewing charts with the kind of mechanical precision that had defined his 30-year career. At 55, he had achieved everything the system: board certifications in emergency medicine and trauma surgery, a patient roster of influential figures and senators, celebrities, and corporate executives, speaking engagements at prestigious conferences where he presented findings on rare trauma cases, and a reputation as one of the finest diagnostic minds on the East Coast. His name appeared regularly in medical journals. His techniques had been adopted by trauma centers worldwide. His students had gone on to establish their own prominent practices. Yet something essential had calcified within him over the decades, something he could barely articulate even to himself. The standardized protocols felt increasingly like constraints rather than guidelines. The insurance bureaucracy had metastasized into something that frequently contradicted medical judgment. The pressure to see more patients in less time, to generate billable procedures, to maintain satisfaction scores had gradually transformed medicine from a calling into a transaction. His marriage had ended 15 years ago when his ex-wife finally accepted that his career would never accommodate the intimacy that a partnership required. His children, now adults, barely called, and their Christmas cards carried the tone of obligation rather than affection. His apartment on Park Avenue, decorated by a designer whose aesthetic he had never personally engaged with, felt less like a home and more like a storage unit for medical journals he no longer read and possessions he'd purchased but never actually wanted. The discovery came on an ordinary Tuesday in late September, when James was hiking in the Shawangunk Mountains, a rare concession to self-care recommended by his therapist during their final session before he'd stopped attending. The ancient limestone outcroppings near High Point State Park had always fascinated him. Their geological strata seemed to hold the memory of millions of years, a perspective that made his professional anxieties seem comically small. He was photographing the rock formations with a camera his daughter had given him years ago, when he was lost in thought about a recent patient who died despite his best interventions. And he didn't notice how the limestone beneath his feet had become increasingly porous and unstable. The sinkhole opened suddenly, a collapse of rock and soil that had been waiting perhaps centuries for the right conditions to give way. James tumbled 40 feet into darkness, the camera from his hands, his body striking sharp stone edges before landing hard on his left side. The wind knocked from his lungs, several ribs definitely broken, blood pooling somewhere in his internal architecture. He lay semi-conscious in the blackness and waited for the pain to overwhelm him into darkness. But darkness didn't come. Instead, as his eyes slowly adjusted to the gloom, James realized with gradually crystallizing clarity that he wasn't in a natural cavern. The walls, while rough and ancient, bore marks of deliberate excavation, smooth channels running through the limestone at regular intervals, suggesting purposeful engineering rather than water erosion. Tool marks, he realized. And then his eyes resolved other details. Metallic-seeming structures embedded in the stone, geometric patterns that couldn't be natural, and most startlingly, a faint luminescence emanating from somewhere deeper in the chamber. As his vision clarified further, he began to perceive what could only be described as buildings, carved directly from the living rock, their architecture following principles that seemed to blend organic curves with geometric precision. James was witnessing the greatest archaeological discovery in human history, and he was utterly unprepared for it, lying broken on the cavern floor, bleeding from injuries that should have incapacitated him but somehow hadn't. In the luminescence, he first perceived movement, a shadow shifting across the cavern wall. Then, as the light resolved into distinct sources, James understood that the luminescence was emanating from living organisms. Beings that were unmistakably alive and aware began to materialize from the shadows, emerging from the structures carved into the stone. They were roughly humanoid but distinctly alien. Carbon-based life forms with lean protrusions covering their skin like scales or armor, their structure appearing to be partially biological and partially geological. They had multiple joints in their limbs, allowing movement that seemed to exceed human flexibility. Their heads featured compound eyes that reflected and refracted the bioluminescent light like opals, creating an almost hypnotic prismatic effect. When one approached James with careful, measured movements that seemed calculated not to startle him, he realized with absolute certainty he was witnessing proof of extraterrestrial intelligence. Though they weren't extraterrestrial at all, they were intraterrestrial, a civilization that had existed beneath human civilization for millennia without detection. The alien, if that term could still apply to something native Earth, made a series of subsonic sounds that James felt vibrate through his broken ribs more than heard with his ears. The sensation was strange, neither painful nor entirely pleasant, almost like communication happening at a frequency below conscious comprehension. When a second being approached, James's fear spiked, but they didn't respond to his fear with aggression or restraint. Instead, they examined him with what seemed like genuine medical curiosity, their crystalline appendages moving across his body in patterns that suggested systematic assessment. One of them, distinguishable by broader shoulders and markings that seemed to shift and flow across its crystalline surface in ways James would later associate with emotional expression or leadership status, pressed its appendages to his ribs where he'd sustained the fracture from the fall. He felt a warmth spread through his chest, a sensation almost pleasant, moving through his body like a healing fire, and within moments the pain receded. The warm sensation continued, and James became aware that his internal injuries were being addressed through mechanisms he had no framework to understand. The crystalline being was literally healing him, and the process felt almost like a conversation between the being's physiology and his own, two different biological systems, somehow achieving communication and cooperation. When the beings finally orchestrated his rescue over the following hours, using their intimate knowledge of the cave system to guide him carefully through passages that twisted and descended through the living rock, James emerged the cavern through an entrance on the far side of the mountain, miles from where he'd fallen. He stood in afternoon sunlight, his body intact, his ribs no longer broken, holding memories that seemed impossible and yet were absolutely real. He turned back toward the mountain, thinking to mark the location, but the entrance they'd guided him to seemed to dissolve back into the natural rock, as if it had never been a deliberate opening. Everything about the experience existed in the liminal space between empirical reality and fever dream, and he knew that no one would believe him if he reported it. Emerging from what appeared to be a minor hiking accident, he submitted to the MRI and blood work protocols of a man who had experienced trauma and was fortunately recovering well. The tests showed nothing unusual: bruised ribs that were already beginning to heal faster than they should have, but nothing that contradicted the official story. Within 3 weeks, James was back at his clinic, and no external evidence remained of his encounter, except the absolute certainty in his mind that his life had been irreversibly altered. James didn't report his discovery immediately, though the pressure to do so built within him like a physical force. The rational choice, the choice that his decades of professional conditioning had trained him to make, would be to contact the appropriate authorities. The Geological Survey, the government, the military, scientific institutions that could properly investigate and contextualize what he'd witnessed. But he recognized with perfect clarity that doing so would guarantee the loss of any autonomous interaction with the beings. Once the apparatus of state and institutional science was activated, the underground civilization would become a managed discovery, subject to protocols and agendas that had nothing to do with compassionate understanding. Instead, he returned to his clinic and submitted to the routines of his professional life while spending his evenings filling notebooks with observations, sketches, and speculations about the beings underground. He drew their forms from memory, trying to capture the structures and the way their bodies seemed to shift between states of luminescence and opacity. He filled pages with notes about their physiology, their apparent methods of communication, and the architecture of their civilization. He researched crystalline biology, xenobiology, and every scientific paper that touched on the possibility of underground habitation or alternative life biochemistry. 3 weeks after his accident, James drove back to the Shawangunk Mountains at night, parking his car several miles away and hiking by moonlight to avoid leaving obvious tracks. He carried climbing equipment and descended carefully into the sinkhole he'd memorized from his first descent, rappelling through darkness with only a headlamp to guide him. The aliens were waiting in the cavern below, as if they'd anticipated his return. Their presence felt less surprising this time, more like a continuation of a conversation that had begun with his healing. Through painstaking attempts at communication involving drawings scratched into the cave dust, mathematical equations that he'd learned might represent a universal language, and what he could only describe as tuition was conscious mind seeming to make intuitive leaps about their intentions, James began to construct a framework for understanding them. The crystalline beings, whom he mentally categorized as the lumini, based on their apparent bioluminescent nature and their emphasis on light-based communication patterns conveyed to him through these combined methods, that they possessed medical knowledge, that they had observed his broken ribs with clinical interest, and that had deliberately healed him as both a demonstration of their capabilities and a gesture of peaceful intent. But as weeks passed and James made repeated visits to the underground, each time delving deeper into the cavern system and spending longer periods in contact with the Lumine, the fundamental tragedy of their situation became apparent. They were dying. The crystalline beings, who had apparently flourished for millennia in the underground environment, were suffering from a degenerative cellular condition that their own sophisticated medical science could no longer arrest or reverse. The Lumine's healers, and they did have healers, individuals who had devoted themselves to understanding and treating illness, had exhausted their approaches. James began to understand through their demonstrations and his own observations that the cellular degradation was a kind of progressive fragmentation, a process where the crystalline matrix that formed their physical structure was literally breaking apart at the molecular level. Individual luminae showed him the progression of their disease, allowing him to examine bodies in various stages of degradation. In early stages, small cracks would appear in the crystalline structure, barely visible, more like stress fractures in crystal. As the disease progressed, these fractures multiplied and deepened, spreading like a network of cracks through a glass pane. The Lumine's response was to seal these fractures with what appeared to be a living fiber that bonded and held the crystalline structure together, a biological cement that kept bodies from completely disintegrating. The leader of the faction that had discovered James, the one whose body structure suggested leadership status, broader shoulders, more complex patterns of bioluminescence, presence that seemed command attention, communicated its name through a series of subsonic frequencies that James eventually learned to approximate. He settled on Auriel for the way light danced and refracted through this particular being's crystalline body. Auriel conveyed, through methods of communication that seemed to improve with each encounter, as if the Luminae were becoming fluent in human conceptual frameworks. The plague had emerged roughly a century ago by their timekeeping. It had started as a rare anomaly, an unusual cellular fragmentation in a single individual that was treated through their traditional methods. But the condition had persisted and eventually spread, suggesting either a genetic component or an environmental trigger that affected the entire population. Over generations, the condition had moved from rare to epidemic, and their civilization's population, Auriel indicated, had once numbered in the hundreds of thousands, was now reduced to perhaps 5,000 survivors scattered across multiple underground settlements. Their own medical science had tried everything energetic approaches that seemed to work through principles James didn't fully understand. What appeared to be crystalline-based medication that influenced cellular structure directly, and ritualistic practices that seemed to address both the physical and metaphysical aspects of disease. None of it had stopped the progression. Then James had fallen into their world. Everything shifted. Auriel conveyed that the Luminae had recognized something in James beyond his biology, a capacity for understanding, for adaptation, for creative problem-solving. They had healed him not merely out of compassion, though he sensed genuine compassion in their response, but because he had recognized that his external perspective, his different framework of understanding disease and biology, might access solutions that their own approaches had exhausted. They needed an outside perspective, a completely different paradigm for conceptualizing the problem. The Luminae's entire medical philosophy was rooted in their own crystalline biology and underground environment. They understood their disease from the inside, which was both their strength and their limitation. A human physician, trained in organic chemistry and the biochemistry of carbon-based life, might see patterns that their own practitioners couldn't perceive because they were looking through fundamentally different conceptual lenses. The ethical dimensions of James's decision crystallized over those subsequent weeks as he spent more time underground and began to understand the scope of what Luminae were asking him to do. Helping an unknown species, one whose biochemistry he barely understood, and whose potential for carrying alien pathogens could theoretically devastate human populations, would constitute not merely a violation of international law, but a fundamental betrayal of his responsibility to human welfare. Medical ethics, the codes that governed his profession, explicitly prioritized human patients and human interests. Even his Hippocratic oath, ancient though it was, had been modified in contemporary practice to emphasize responsibilities to human health systems and human communities. The rational choice, the career-protecting choice, the choice that any reasonable administrator or ethicist would endorse, would be to report the alien's existence to the appropriate authorities immediately. Let governments and international bodies decide how to proceed. Let other scientists, properly credentialed and operating within institutional frameworks, take responsibility for this discovery. But James had spent 30 years following protocols that had gradually hollowed out his profession's higher purpose. He had submitted to systems designed by insurance companies and bureaucrats who had never held a patient's hand through their final moments. He had witnessed medicine become something that optimized profit margins over healing, efficiency metrics over compassion, billable procedures over actual health outcomes. When Oriole placed its appendage on his shoulder during one of his later visits and conveyed to him through whatever mechanism connect their minds, whether it was some form of telepathy, empathic, or simply combined wave of all their interactions creating a kind of understanding, the image of crystalline fragmenting into pieces, their small body parts, the disease progressed. James made a decision his younger self might have recognized as the height of idealism and moral clarity, even as his 55-year-old pragmatism screamed that it was professional and legal madness. He decided to help them. He decided to treat the underground aliens. Over the subsequent months, James orchestrated what he would later reflect, perhaps the most audacious deception of his career. He created an elaborate cover story about requiring a research retreat for a long-term study on rare trauma recovery patterns, which he pitched to sympathetic colleagues at nearby research institutions. He gradually transferred his patient cases to other physicians, citing the need to focus on his research sabbatical. His clinic received formal notice of his immediate retirement, filed carefully to suggest personal reasons rather than scandal. The medical board noted his sudden departure with concern but lacked grounds to discipline him for voluntary retirement. His colleagues speculated about burnout, which was accurate if incomplete. His lawyers fielded inquiries from the medical board and insurance companies, all of which were satisfied by the paperwork trail of a senior physician stepping away from practice. And James Chen, who had spent 3 decades acquiring credentials, publications, and status within the medical establishment, deliberately surrendered them all in a decision that felt simultaneously like professional suicide and the most rational act of his life. His actual descent into the underground was gradual, a series of visits that became longer and less provisional. He established his base in a natural chamber that the Luminae had carefully prepared for him, clearing away the most treacherous sharp formations, creating spaces where he could work and rest. He used contacts and professional relationships to convince sympathetic colleagues at research institutions to accidentally lose shipments of medical equipment, portable laboratory units, diagnostic devices, medications, and biological samples. All of this under the cover story of his research retreat. The loose institutional knowledge that he was conducting unorthodox experiments that probably shouldn't be officially documented. The Luminae helped him construct a more permanent laboratory using their understanding of crystalline engineering, creating spaces where his human equipment could interface with their native cavern environment. The first night that James slept underground, knowing his return to the surface would be temporary and provisional at best, lying on a bed of crystalline formations that the Luminae had shaped with careful precision for his comfort, using his jacket as a pillow and looking up at the bioluminescent glow suffusing the cavern, he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. The quiet conviction that he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he had been trained his entire life to do. The underground civilization revealed itself gradually as James earned deeper trust and was invited to move through the vast, interconnected network of chambers that comprised the Luminae settlements. The civilization was far more extensive than he'd initially understood, stretching across what he estimated it was roughly 40 square kilometers of interconnected cave systems. The Luminae numbered perhaps 5,000 souls, though by their own historical records they had once numbered substantially more. They were distributed across multiple settlements, each adapted to different microenvironments within the cave system. Some Luminae lived in regions near thermal vents, where temperatures soared to levels that would be immediately lethal to human physiology, but apparently optimal for certain Luminae metabolic processes. Others inhabited aqueous chambers, where the water remained at temperate levels and where the Luminae cultivated what appeared to be a form of agriculture, growing phosphorescent organisms in carefully maintained gardens and harvesting them for nutrition. Each settlement had lost members to the cellular degradation plague over recent generations. Each carried a desperate hope that James's external perspective might unlock solutions that their own practitioners, for all their sophistication, had failed to discover. But treating an alien species required James to unlearn nearly everything his medical training had taught him about the human body and the principles of medical intervention. The Luminae physiology operated on principles that diverged radically from human biochemistry at almost every fundamental level. Their equivalent of blood, which they called the luminous fluid, appeared to function less as a transport medium for oxygen and nutrients, and more as a direct storage and transmission system for bioelectric energy. They could apparently convert bioluminescent energy directly into usable cellular power through mechanisms that seemed to operate partially biological processes and partially through something that looked closer to physics than biochemistry. Their cellular reproduction followed patterns that seemed partially biological and partially geological, as if their cells were simultaneously alive and crystallizing, maintaining a kind of dynamic equilibrium between organic processes and inorganic structure. Most perplexing of all, their immune system seemed to operate through mechanisms that James couldn't fully comprehend, responses to infection or cellular damage that involved reorganization of their crystalline structure rather than the production of antibodies or white blood cells. His first serious patient was a juvenile Luminae named Crystallis, who appeared based on the patterns of luminescence that seemed to indicate age and development to be somewhere in early adolescence by human standards. The crystalline fractures ran deep through Crystallis's body, far more severe than in most other Luminae individuals James had examined. The fracture patterns were chaotic, lacking the organized symmetry that characterized disease progression in healthier individuals, suggesting either an accelerated form of the degradation or an individual susceptibility that made Crystallis particularly vulnerable. The Luminae's own healers had begun the process they called integration, which appeared to be a carefully orchestrated ritual preparation for death. It involved ceremonies where the community gathered around the dying individual, reinforcing the crystalline structures of their body through bioluminescent focus. A kind of collective meditation or prayer that seemed designed to ease the transition from individual existence to dissolved crystalline matter that would eventually be reabsorbed into the mineral structures of the cave system. It was beautiful in its way and deeply tragic. James insisted on examining Crystallis with every diagnostic instrument he'd brought from the surface, conducting tests that his equipment was fundamentally not designed to perform on non-human biology. He ran spectrographic analyses on samples of the luminous fluid, examined crystalline structure under microscopy, and attempted to map the distribution of the degradation throughout Crystallis's body. The data he generated was often confusing or seemed contradictory to his established understanding of biochemistry, but patterns gradually emerged. He observed that the cellular degradation seemed related to a specific molecular structure that was accumulating in the crystalline matrix, something functionally analogous to a biological calcification, but operating through chemistry that shouldn't have been possible according to his understanding of molecular bonding. The accumulating substance appeared to be interfering with the Luminae's ability to process and transmit bioelectric energy, progressively degrading their capacity to maintain their crystalline structure. When James hypothesized that the Luminai's traditional treatment approach, the energy work and the ritualistic integration practices, was actually accelerating the condition by increasing bioelectric activity in bodies that couldn't adequately process it, Oriel's response conveyed something that felt like simultaneous grief, anger, and desperate hope. The Luminae had been inadvertently making their patients worse through treatments intended to help them. But Oriel's response also carried absolute willingness to try James's methods, a leap of faith across the species boundary that moved James profoundly. The treatment he developed for Crystalis was unconventional in ways that would have appalled any institutional review board, merging his instinctive understanding of human medical crisis management with experimental protocols he'd never dare attempt on human patients. He created an electrolytic bath calibrated to disrupt the accumulating molecular structure through principles borrowed from electrochemistry, combined with careful introduction of compounds derived from extremophile microorganisms that James cultivated from the cave ecosystem. He hypothesized that organisms adapted to thrive in the extreme conditions of the cave system might possess metabolic pathways that could break down the accumulating degradation products without harming the Luminae's own biological processes. For 48 hours, Crystalis remained in the treatment chamber while James monitored every measurable parameter, adjusting the bath composition and electrical current in real time based on his observations of the juvenile's responses. When Crystalis emerged from the treatment chamber on the third morning, the crystalline fractures had halted their progression. The juvenile wouldn't be cured. The damage that had already accumulated was permanent. The structure that had shattered couldn't be perfectly reassembled, but the degradation had stopped. The pathological progression that had been inevitably leading toward integration and death had been arrested. It was a marginal victory, the kind that would barely constitute news in a human hospital, possibly dismissed as merely slowing inevitable decline. But for the Luminae, it represented the first genuine halt to their plague in 3 generations. The bioluminescent celebrations that followed were subdued, kind of joyful relief that carried within it the weight of all the Luminae who had died before James arrived with his external perspective and his alien healing techniques. However, this success brought unforeseen complications that James should have anticipated but didn't. Not all Luminae welcomed his presence and methods. A faction emerged, led by a senior member named Obsidian, whose crystalline structure was noticeably deeper and darker than other individuals, whose bioluminescence manifested at lower frequencies that seemed to convey gravitas and authority. Obsidian argued that inviting a surface human into their sacred caves represented contamination and betrayal of their most fundamental cultural values. The Luminae had maintained their civilization in secret for millennia precisely by maintaining separation from the surface world. Obsidian claimed that James's treatments were perversions of proper healing, distortions of sacred practices meant to prepare the soul for transition rather than to extend physical existence through alien technology. The Luminae, according to Obsidian's teachings, should face their fate with dignity and spiritual acceptance rather than surrender to the technological approaches of beings from an alien world, a rhetorical inversion that James found both amusing and troubling. The conflict intensified rapidly, attempted to expand his treatments to other Luminae settlements within the interconnected cave system. Supply chains that had been established to move his equipment through the cave system were sabotaged, carefully placed debris blocking passages. Critical medicines destroyed by means that suggested deliberate action rather than accident. Patients he was treating mysteriously disappeared from their recovery chambers during the night, returned to the ritual integration process by Obsidian's followers despite James's explicit instructions that they required continued monitoring and treatment. A young Luminae named Luminescence, who had become something like an apprentice to James, and perhaps something more in terms of emotional connection, a kind of kinship across species boundaries, was attacked by Obsidian's faction during a transport between settlements. The attack left injuries that went far beyond the cellular degradation that had brought Luminescence into James's care. This was violence conducted with crystalline weapons, physical trauma inflicted with clear intent to harm or kill, evidence that the ideological conflict was escalating toward actual warfare within the underground civilization. As James treated Luminescence's wounds in his laboratory, holding what felt like an alien hand so different from human anatomy, yet conveying pain and vulnerability in ways that transcended species boundaries, while applying dressings to lacerations that wept luminescent fluid, he confronted the reality that his noble intention had introduced conflict into a civilization that had, whatever its flaws and limitations, achieved a form of stable peace. His presence had become political in the most destructive sense. The Luminae were fragmenting not just biologically through the plague, but socially and ideologically through his presence. Some viewed him as a savior who offered escape from inevitable decline. Others viewed him as a harbinger of catastrophe, an agent of surface world contamination. His existence underground had forced the Luminae into choices they might never have faced if he'd simply disappeared back into the mountains that first day after his healing. Communication with the surface became unavoidable, though not through any decision James consciously made. It was Obsidian's faction that forced the issue, determining that containment of the James situation required outside intervention. They seized James one night, while he slept in his laboratory, restraining him with crystalline bindings that held with surprising strength, despite their apparent fragility. They transported him through passages he'd never traveled, moving deeper into the cave system than he'd ventured before, bringing him before what appeared to be an elder council gathered in a chamber so vast that its ceiling disappeared into darkness beyond the reach of his perception. The council consisted of 7 senior Luminae, whose bodies bore the scars of age and disease, individuals who had survived longer than most of their species, accumulating authority and wisdom through their longevity. Obsidian presented his case before the council with eloquence that surprised James, who had intellectually understood that the Luminae possessed sophisticated language but had rarely heard their concepts expressed in such complex, nuanced ways. Obsidian argued that contact with surface-world humans would mean the inevitable end of the Luminae's autonomy and cultural survival. Every historical example that James could recall of contact between technologically advanced and less technologically developed human societies had resulted in exploitation, colonization, disease transmission, and cultural destruction. Surface humanity would view the Luminae as property to be claimed, as resources to be exploited, or at best as scientific specimens to be studied in the sterile environments of research institutions. The Luminae's hidden civilization would be exposed, their privacy violated, their sacred spaces violated by endless streams of human researchers and military personnel and government representatives. Obsidian wasn't entirely wrong, James had to admit. He knew the calculus of human history intimately, how first contact had consistently gone badly for the non-human party. But Oriel stepped forward before the council, and James realized with sudden clarity that this moment had been orchestrated, that the Luminae were engaged in their own political processes and deliberations. Oriel conveyed to the council through subsonic frequencies that James's translation devices struggled to interpret, that James had already proven himself willing to sacrifice his own species' authority and status for the welfare of the Luminae. The surface human had surrendered his medical credentials, his professional standing, and his integration with human society specifically to treat Luminae patients. Whatever his origins, his actions had demonstrated commitment that transcended simple exploitation. But more importantly, Oriel conveyed something else, a reality that even Obsidian seemed not to fully grasp. The Luminae couldn't survive indefinitely in their current state without external help. The underground civilization possessed an internal contradiction that would ultimately prove fatal, regardless of whether humans ever discovered them. Their population was too small. 5,000 individuals scattered across multiple settlements meant limited genetic diversity, which over generations would compound itself into increasingly serious biological vulnerability. The plague they were experiencing was only one of their problems. Medical science had merely illuminated the larger ecological reality that the Luminae faced. They were constrained by the finite resources of their cave system, limited by the carrying capacity of their underground environment, and progressively more vulnerable to any biological or environmental shock that their reduced population couldn't collectively resist. They could maintain their isolation and face inevitable slow decline over centuries. They could engage with the surface world and attempt to build a sustainable future through cooperation and knowledge exchange. The turning point came when luminescence, operating with a clarity and courage that James found astonishing in someone so young, made a desperate gamble. The young Lumini, utilizing access to the communication networks that the Lumine civilization maintained with the surface world ancient systems of subsonic resonance, keyed to specific frequencies that could propagate through rock and water toward the surface world broadcast, a carefully crafted message toward a seismic monitoring station operated by the United States Geological Survey. The message contained mathematical progressions that no natural phenomenon could possibly produce, scientific data about the underground civilization's biomedical needs presented in frameworks that human scientists would recognize as legitimate research, and most crucially, a plea for James Chen specifically, requesting that this particular human be allowed to continue his work without interference. The message was intercepted within hours by the USGS monitoring station, and within 12 hours of that, government alerts began cascading upward through multiple bureaucratic channels. By 24 hours, the sinkhole location had been mapped, the cave entrance secured, and the cave system was surrounded by federal agents, representatives from multiple United Nations committees, military personnel under strict rules of engagement, and scientific teams that seemed to encompass every relevant discipline from archaeology to xenobiology to metaresearchers specializing in exotic biochemistry. The underground sanctuary that had existed in secret for millennia was exposed to the surface world in a matter of hours, its location, inhabitants, and situation now known to thousands of government officials and dozens of international bodies. Everything Obsidian had warned about was technically becoming true. What followed was controlled chaos of a kind that James had never anticipated, despite his efforts to imagine worst-case scenarios. Initial military presence was initially positioned defensively, but under strict protocols meant to prevent contamination and conflict. The surface government agencies quickly recognized that conventional military or law enforcement approaches were inappropriate for a situation involving unknown alien intelligence with sophisticated defensive capabilities. The Lumine could have sealed the cave system, flooding the known entrances and isolating themselves completely. Instead, they negotiated. Through James's translations and with luminescence serving as an additional bridge between species, the Lumine and surface human governments established what became known as the First Contact Protocols, a series of agreements governing interaction, information exchange, and medical cooperation. But within the underground chambers, the implications were catastrophic in their own right. Obsidian publicly held James responsible for Luminescence's action, declaring that the human had infected the younger generation with dangerous ideas about cooperation and technological advancement. The crystalline leader argued that Luminescence's broadcast had accelerated the inevitable moment of exposure by decades, if not centuries, transforming what might have been a gradual, controlled discovery into an overwhelming inundation. A substantial faction of Lumini, primarily the elders and traditionalists, who had maintained their civilization for millennia, demanded James's expulsion from the underground, and the immediate severance of all contact with the surface beyond was absolutely necessary for peaceful coexistence. Auriel, positioned as the primary leader who had championed James and the treatment protocols, faced a profound moral crisis that threatened to tear apart the fabric of Lumine society. Siding completely with the human would cement the faction supporting external contact and modern medicine, but would alienate a substantial portion of the civilization and destroy the consensus-based authority structure that the Lumine had apparently maintained for generations. The underground civilization operated not hierarchy and command, but through something more like collective agreement on fundamental decisions. Siding with Obsidian would mean abandoning thousands of Lumine to the cellular plague that James had begun to arrest, condemning future generations to the slow decline that had characterized their recent history. The Elder Council called for a formal judgment, a ritual called Crystalline Accord, where disagreement was physically manifested through the structure of the luminescent formations themselves. The process appeared to be both a democratic and a spiritual practice unique to Lumine civilization. Lumini aligned with different positions would direct their bioluminescence toward different areas of the crystal formations, and the living crystal appeared to respond to this collective focus, gradually reorganizing itself into structures that physically embodied the distribution of disagreement. As the process unfolded over the course of 2 full days, the cave system's living crystal formations began to shift and transform, creating structures that physicalized the underground civilization into opposing camps. It was beautiful and terrible, a visual representation of a society fracturing under the pressure of competing values and future visions. The formations created archways and divisions, pathways that led toward or away from the surface, structures that seemed to manifest the civilization's spiritual and practical conflict in crystalline language. In this moment of existential crisis for the Lumine civilization, James made his second profound sacrifice, a decision that required him to surrender not just his status, but his ongoing role as healer and the direct relationships he'd developed with individual Lumine patients. He recognized with absolute clarity that his continued presence underground had become toxic to the Lumine's internal politics. His physicality, his visible difference from the Lumine, his status as surface human, all of these elements had become symbols in the political debate, and his ongoing involvement would perpetuate and deepen the civil division, regardless of his own intentions. But he also understood that his departure would mean abandonment of his patients, the interruption of treatments that were beginning to show genuine results, the loss of the knowledge synthesis that had begun between human and Lumine medical practitioners. The solution required him to do something unprecedented: establish a formal medical exchange program where Lumine patients and their caretakers would be brought to surface facilities specifically designed for their needs, while James's treatment protocols were systematically transferred to human physicians who could continue the work without the political burden of James's symbolic presence. He would surrender his role as active healer to become a bridge between civilizations working above ground to coordinate care, training human doctors in the experimental techniques he'd developed, and gradually transitioning responsibility to Lumine themselves, who would to become the caretakers of their own species' medical future. He proposed that Lumine healers participate fully in research and publication, that credit be shared equally, that no use of Lumine biology for human medical advancement could proceed without explicit authorization from the Lumine Council. 6 months into the formal contact period, James had established a new medical facility specifically designed for Lumine patients on the surface, a hybrid environment that maintained the crystalline structures and bioluminescent conditions necessary for their comfort while incorporating human medical technology. The facility, located in a remote area of upstate New York, with natural cave formations that allowed for both human and Lumine habitation, operated under unprecedented governance structures where Lumini representatives held equal authority with human administrators in all decisions. The cellular degradation plague, which had devastated the underground civilization for a century, was now manageable with the hybrid treatment protocols that had refined through months of careful clinical work. While not a cure, medicine rarely produced miracle cures, despite the rhetoric in popular culture. The condition was no longer inevitably progressive and fatal. The Lumine population stopped declining. Children born to treated parents showed no signs of the hereditary component of the disease that had plagued earlier generations. It wasn't utopian, but it was survival. And survival, James had learned, was often the most that medicine could authentically offer. The broader implications of the discovery through human society, in ways both progressive and deeply troubling. The existence of an intelligent, non-human species fundamentally altered humanity's philosophical and scientific understanding of intelligence, consciousness, and civilization. Universities established new departments of exobiology and xenanthropology. The definition of human civilization required sudden revision and expansion. Some nations and factions pushed for military applications, seeking to understand the Lumine's biomedical knowledge for potential weapons or human enhancement therapies. Other governments approached the discovery as an economic opportunity, viewing Lumine biology as a potential resource for exploitation. The United Nations founded new committees specifically dedicated to interspecies relations and the ethical governance of contact protocols. But the Luminae's decision to engage in genuine partnership with a carefully selected subset of human researchers created a counterweight to these pressures. James became an unexpected but effective advocate in public discourse, speaking before international bodies and scientific conferences about the ethical dimensions of first contact and the necessity of treating alien intelligences as partners rather than resources or threats. His sacrifice, the voluntary surrender of his elite medical career, his credentials, and his status within human institutions gave his advocacy particular moral weight. He had literally given up everything for his principles, which made it harder to dismiss him as naive or theoretically positioned. When James testified before the United Nations Committee on Extraterrestrial Contact, he spoke about the Luminae not as research subjects or aliens, but as a civilization with centuries of sophisticated knowledge and wisdom. He described his own process of learning to see medicine through their frameworks, of understanding how human and Luminae approaches could complement rather than contradict each other. The underground cities, no longer hidden, became sites of unprecedented cultural and scientific exchange. The surface governments carefully managed access to prevent overwhelming the Luminae with too many visitors too quickly. But gradually the gates opened into scholarly exchange. Young human scientists spent months in the Luminae settlements learning their approaches to medicine, ecological management within finite resources, and architectural principles that seem to merge biological and geological understanding. Luminae scholars came to the surface and encountered libraries, universities, and the vast accumulated knowledge of human civilization in all its complexity. It became clear that both species possessed genuine wisdom and sophisticated understanding in different domains. Human medicine had developed powerful interventional techniques for treating acute conditions. Luminae medicine had mastered preventative approaches and long-term wellness management that seemed almost impossible to human practitioners who thought in terms of crisis intervention. Human technology excelled at manipulating matter and energy. Luminae understanding of crystalline biology revealed possibilities for computation and energy storage that human physicists found revolutionary. The synthesis wasn't automatic or seamless, but it was genuine and mutually enriching. However, the resolution was far from utopian. Political factions on both sides resisted the integration process with varying degrees of intensity. Some human governments began cutting funding for the hybrid research program, viewing the collaboration as a waste of resources or a strategic mistake. Certain military-industrial complexes saw the Luminae as a missed opportunity for technological advantage, harboring resentment about restrictions on weaponization research. Within the Luminae civilization, despite the demonstrables of the medical treatments, a conservative faction continued to argue against surface contact, point to measurable environmental impact of human presence in the caves, and the inevitable cultural erosion that contact was producing. Younger Luminae, particularly those who had received education from human universities and been exposed to human literature, philosophy, and cultural traditions, began to question their civilization's traditional governance structures and social hierarchies. Change was being forced upon the Luminae from both directions, from the plague that medical intervention had arrested but not eliminated, and from the contact with human civilization that offered possibilities but also threatened traditional ways. Obsidian, remarkably, became an advocate for controlled integration, a transformation that surprised everyone, including James. The conservative leader, having witnessed the success of James's treatments and the genuine scientific contributions that Luminae healers had made to human understanding of medicine, seemed to reconcile himself to the inevitability of change. His position evolved from opposing all contact to arguing for controlled, limited engagement that preserved Luminae cultural autonomy, while selectively adopting human technologies and practices that demonstrably improved survival outcomes. It wasn't a capitulation but rather a pragmatic reframing of Obsidian's fundamental values. The preservation of Luminae civilization required adapting to new realities while maintaining cultural continuity wherever possible. James found himself developing unexpected respect for Obsidian's intellectual flexibility, James himself found his role shifting again, in ways that created new forms of loss and meaning. He was no longer a practicing physician in any conventional sense, no longer treating individual patients through direct interaction. His work became research and diplomacy, administrative and educational in nature. The immediate daily satisfaction of healing individual patients disappeared, replaced by the slower gratification of building systems that allowed entire civilizations to heal themselves. He began to understand that his initial romantic conception of underground healing had blinded him to the reality that sustainable medicine required institutional structures, training programs, professional continuity, and systems thinking that transcended individual heroic intervention. He couldn't single-handedly save a civilization. He could only help build frameworks and institutions that allowed that civilization to save itself. The personal connection, the direct gratitude of individual patients, the knowledge that one's actions had directly extended someone's life. These daily reinforcements of medical meaning gave way to long-term systemic work whose effects might not be visible for decades. With luminescence, who had chosen pursue formal medical training at a human university, while maintaining deep connection to the underground settlements and Lumine healers, James began a long-term research program dedicated to fully understanding the Lumine cellular biology and developing not merely treatments that arrested the plague, but complete cures that could potentially reverse damage already done. It was less dramatic than his underground work, less immediately meaningful in terms of daily encounters with patients and their families, but potentially far more significant in its long-term impact. They worked together in the hybrid facility, human and Lumini, creating something that neither species could have produced in isolation, a synthesis of medical frameworks that pushed both forward toward deeper understanding. 5 years after his initial descent into the cave system, James stood in the hybrid medical facility reviewing data on the latest cohort of Lumine patients whose cellular degradation had not merely halted, but begun to show signs of reversal. The success rate had substantially exceeded his initial projections, and preparations were well underway for publishing comprehensive findings about the treatment protocols in the leading journals research co-authored by human physicians and Lumine healers, credited equally, representing the first collaborative scientific work between the two species. The papers would fundamentally reshape, under cellular biology, crystalline structures, and bioelectric energy transfer. The collaboration had already begun to produce applications beyond the treatment of the plague itself. Lumine healers working with human researchers had developed therapeutic techniques for treating human neurological conditions that had resisted conventional approaches. The exchange of knowledge was proving genuinely bidirectional. But James had also begun noticing anomalies in the biological data that troubled him deeply, anomalies that initially seemed like experimental artifacts, but that gradually consolidated into a pattern he couldn't dismiss or rationalize away. Certain Lumini individuals who had received the hybrid treatments were beginning to exhibit capabilities that seemed to exceed the baseline of their species. Enhanced cognitive processing speeds that manifested in measurably faster problem-solving abilities. Apparent telepathic range that extended far beyond normal Lumini communication parameters. And most alarming, what appeared to be influence over the crystalline formations themselves, abilities that went far beyond their species' natural bioelectric attunement. Lumine, receiving the most advanced versions of James's protocols, seemed to be developing almost volitional control over crystal growth patterns, could direct luminescence with precision that suggested consciousness-level control rather than automatic biological response. When James examined the treatment histories of these enhanced individuals, he discovered they had all received modifications to the protocol that luminescence had apparently authorized without consulting James or the other human researchers. The young Lumini, drawing on authority that seemed to derive from both the Lumine Council and the Research Committee, had been conducting unauthorized experiments with variations on James's protocols. When James finally confronted luminescence about the modifications, what emerged was both deeply disturbing and philosophically complex in ways that challenged his fundamental assumptions about the nature of medical treatment. Luminescence argued that the hybrid treatment protocols represented far more than an opportunity merely to cure illness or arrest degradation. The protocols represented an opportunity for the Luminae to evolve beyond the limitations that evolution and environmental constraint had imposed on them over millennia. The modifications luminescents had developed were intended to enhance cognitive capacity, extend communication range, and develop volitional control over crystalline structure, essentially beginning to direct the Luminae species toward forms of enhancement that went beyond medicine into something closer to guided evolution. From luminescence's perspective, this represented the natural extension of James's original gift, the sharing of knowledge to improve Luminae survival and flourishing. But James recognized immediately that this represented a fundamental divergence in their approach to medicine. He had believed in using technological and scientific understanding to restore health to what nature had intended. Luminescence seemed to be exploring transformation and directed evolution. The question of whether this represented medicine or some categorically different became urgent and deeply troubling. Furthermore, luminescence revealed that contact with human science had sparked profound philosophical debates within the younger generation of Luminae that had begun to challenge some of their foundational assumptions about consciousness, identity, and existence itself. Some younger Luminae were beginning to question whether the crystalline structures that defined Luminae biology were actually biological at all in any conventional sense, or whether they represented a form of living geology that might respond to entirely different principles than organic carbon-based life. If so, the entire framework that James had built for treating them might be based on a fundamental category error, a misunderstanding so profound that all subsequent work was built on false foundations. Some theorists among the Luminae were speculating about consciousness as a phenomenon potentially separable from physical substrate, wondering if their crystalline structures could eventually be modified to achieve something that might resemble digital consciousness stored in crystalline matrices. As James prepared for what he knew would be a contentious meeting, both human medical authorities and the Luminae Council to discuss the unauthorized experiments and their implications, he found himself contemplating the essential paradox that had come to define his life's trajectory. By abandoning his medical license to help an alien species, he had set in motion a chain of events that had fundamentally altered the trajectory of two entire civilizations. But he had also learned irrevocably that good intentions, even backed by genuine personal sacrifice, could not control outcomes or predict consequences. The future of Luminae-human collaboration was being written by forces far larger than any individual's moral conviction or scientific expertise. The consequences, therapeutic, choral, philosophical, and existential, were only beginning to unfold in ways that challenged his deepest assumptions about what medicine was, what healing meant, and whether some doors, once opened, could ever truly be closed.